He built an empire on fear. He ruled New York's underworld without mercy, without hesitation, without a single regret. Kang Min-jae was untouchable, until the night the one woman who ever truly loved him quietly signed the divorce papers, walked to the door, and he let her go with 7 brutal words. "Don't expect me to regret it." She didn't beg, she didn't cry, she simply left. And that was the moment the most feared man in the city made the worst mistake of his life. If you've ever loved someone too late, this story is for you. Hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and follow along until the very end. You will not want to miss what happens next. Bessie. The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time Kang Min-jae's convoy rolled through the underground garage of the Ashford Tower, the streets of Manhattan were completely empty. 3 black SUVs, tinted windows, no plates. The kind of arrival that didn't invite questions. His security detail moved in practiced silence. 4 men fanning out across the concrete before the middle vehicle even stopped, hands loose at their sides, eyes scanning angles that most people never thought to look at. Min-jae stepped out without waiting for the door to be opened for him. That was one of his habits. He didn't like being handled. He was 34 years old and looked like someone had carved him out of something harder than bone. 6 feet of contained tension. Dark suit, no tie, collar button undone. Not from carelessness, but from the particular arrogance of a man who knew the rules well enough to know exactly which ones he could break. His face was the kind that made people step back without understanding why. Sharp jaw, darker eyes than most people could hold for long, a stillness around him that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of something waiting. He crossed the garage without speaking to anyone. His head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Dae-won, fell into step beside him and rattled off the evening's agenda in a low, clipped voice. Board meeting moved to 9 tomorrow. The Castellano situation required a decision before Friday. The Brentwood account had been flagged again, and one of the lower lieutenants was apparently asking questions he shouldn't be asking. Min-jae listened without responding. He pressed the elevator call button himself, stepped inside alone, and let the doors close. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the Ashford. 4,200 square feet of floor-to-ceiling glass, imported stone, furniture that cost more than most people made in a year. The elevator opened directly into the foyer, and the first thing Min-jae noticed when he stepped inside was the smell. Garlic, white wine, something slow roasting in the oven. He loosened his jaw without meaning to, set his keys on the entry table, moved through the foyer into the open living space, and found her in the kitchen, her back to him, stirring something in a pan. Arya Whitmore, or rather, Arya Kang, though she had never once corrected anyone who used her maiden name because he had never asked her to change it, was wearing a cream-colored blouse tucked into dark trousers, her dark hair pulled loosely over one shoulder. She was barefoot. She always cooked barefoot. He had never asked her why. She didn't turn around when he entered, but she knew he was there. "You're later than usual," she said. Not accusatory, just noting it the way someone might note the weather. "Traffic." He moved to the bar cart near the window and poured 2 fingers of bourbon without offering her any. She didn't drink bourbon. Another thing he knew without ever having learned it through conversation. "I made lamb," she said, "with the rosemary you like." He didn't respond to that. He stood at the window with his drink and looked out at the city, a grid of amber lights blurred by rain, and felt the familiar sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be while simultaneously feeling nothing about it. That was the texture of his evenings. Always had been. Arya plated the food without asking if he was hungry. She set 2 plates on the dining table, poured herself a glass of sparkling water, and sat down. She didn't call him over. She had stopped doing that somewhere around the 8-month mark. Now she simply sat, and eventually he would come, or he wouldn't. Tonight he came. He sat across from her, cut into the lamb, and ate with the mechanical efficiency of a man refueling rather than dining. The food was excellent. It always was. Arya had grown up in a household where the table was a ritual, and she cooked the way she did most things, with complete, quiet attention. He didn't tell her it was good. He had a habit of withholding compliments the way other men withheld money. Not from cruelty, exactly. More from the deep-seated conviction that acknowledgement created obligation, and obligation was a leash. "Your grandmother called," Arya said. Min Jae's fork paused for a fraction of a second. Then he continued eating. About what? She wants us at the estate Sunday. Apparently she's hosting the Lim family. A pause. She mentioned it would be good for us to present a unified front given the Holloway coverage last week. The Holloway coverage. A business journal had run a piece connecting one of Min Jae's real estate holding companies to a federal investigation into money laundering. The story had been vague, sourced poorly, and had disappeared from the news cycle within 48 hours, which was not an accident. But it had been enough to make his grandmother nervous. And when his grandmother became nervous, she orchestrated social appearances the way generals orchestrated troop movements. "I'll be in Chicago Sunday," he said. "I'll let her know," Arya said. No argument, no visible disappointment. She lifted her glass and took a small sip and looked out at the rain on the windows. He watched her for a moment. She had a profile that was easy to watch, clean lines, a composure that seemed genuine rather than practiced. When he'd first been told he was going to marry her, he'd looked her up the same way he'd look up a business acquisition. Assets, liabilities, family reputation, financial exposure. She had come from the Whitmore family, old Connecticut money, with the kind of clean public face that was worth something in a crisis. Her father sat on 2 nonprofit boards and had once been photographed with a senator. Her mother was European, French on one side, which gave Arya something in her bearing that Min Jae had found useful at dinners where impressions mattered. He had never thought of her as a person he might actually know, and in 3 years he still hadn't tried. He finished eating, set his utensils down, and stood without clearing his plate. "I have calls until midnight." "Okay," she said. He went to his study. Behind him he heard the quiet sounds of her clearing the table alone. The soft scrape of ceramic, water running, the specific hush of someone who had long ago learned to occupy space without making demands on it. He closed the study door and didn't think about it again. That was in September. By October, the distance between them had taken on a new texture. Not wider exactly, but harder. Like something that had once been ice turning slowly into stone. Arya continued her routines with a precision that Min Jae noticed only in the peripheral way he noticed most things about her. The morning coffee appeared. The dry cleaning disappeared and returned. The penthouse maintained its impossible cleanliness without visible effort because all the effort was hers. She attended the events that required a spouse. She stood beside him in the right rooms, wearing the right things, saying the right amount. She was never embarrassing, never demanding, never loud. The wives of his business associates respected her. The press photographed her well. His grandmother approved of her in the cold, measuring way she approved of anything that served a function. And Arya smiled through all of it with something that took Min Jae a long time to identify, because he had never bothered to look closely enough. Not happiness, not performance, endurance. The dinner with Sabrina Vale happened on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of October, and it happened because Min Jae allowed it to, which was the first of several decisions he would eventually have cause to examine. Sabrina had been his for 2 years before the marriage. That was how he thought of it. She had been his, the way a particular city block or a particular account was his, meaning he had controlled the terms of the thing and she had understood those terms. She was 36 now, dark-haired, sharp in a way that showed in her face, and she ran the legitimate finance side of 3 of his holding companies with an efficiency that made her professionally indispensable. The relationship had ended, at his direction, without drama, because she was smart enough to know that drama with him was a permanent exit, and they had continued working together as if it had never happened. Min Jae preferred it that way. Compartmentalization was a survival skill in his world, and he had refined it to an art. But Sabrina was also the kind of woman who understood the value of proximity, and she had spent 3 years maintaining proximity without ever overstepping in a way that could be called out directly. She was always professional, always appropriate, always somehow present. He had invited her to the dinner because the dinner was also business. A negotiation with 2 European partners who preferred informal settings, and Sabrina's fluency in that kind of fluid, sophisticated social intelligence was genuinely useful. He had not considered how it would look to Arya. Or more accurately, he had considered it and decided it wasn't a relevant variable. The dinner was at Marchetti, a private members' restaurant in the West Village, where the tables were spaced far enough apart for genuine conversation. Arya was already seated when Min Jae arrived with Sabrina, deep in easy conversation with one of the European partners' wives, her posture relaxed, one hand curled lightly around a wine glass. She looked up when he approached, and for a half second, so brief that most people wouldn't catch it, her eyes moved from Minjae's face to Sabrina's, and something crossed her expression like a shadow moving across a floor. Then it was gone. She smiled. She stood to greet them. "Sabrina," she said, "it's been a while." "Arya." Sabrina kissed her cheek with the ease of someone who had never once felt threatened. "You look incredible. Marriage clearly agrees with you." The sentence hung in the air with its particular, precise cruelty, the kind that was delivered so lightly that calling it out would make the recipient seem unreasonable. Arya laughed softly. "Thank you." They sat. The dinner moved through its courses. Minjae managed the business conversation with his usual controlled efficiency, listening more than speaking, redirecting when necessary, closing the angles he needed closed. Sabrina was effective, as always. She translated silences, softened friction, and knew exactly when to be charming and when to be formidable. Arya watched it all with the particular attention of someone who has become skilled at reading a room while appearing to simply be enjoying the evening. And then, over the dessert course, one of the European partners, a Milanese man named Ferretti, who had been drinking well and whose filter had correspondingly thinned, leaned back in his chair and looked at Minjae with a wide, conspiratorial smile. "Tell me something," Ferretti said. He gestured loosely between Minjae and Arya. 3 years together. Has the great Kang Minjae finally fallen in love with his wife? The table went quiet in that way that happens when a question lands too directly, when everyone present recognizes that something real has just been asked, and they're all waiting to see how it gets navigated. Minjae set down his espresso cup. He looked at Ferretti with an expression that was perfectly neutral. "No," he said. One word, flat, unequivocal, delivered without hesitation and without the slightest glance in Arya's direction. The table attempted to recover. Sabrina laughed softly. Ferretti raised his glass in some gesture of toast. The conversation moved forward, but the word had already done what it was going to do. It had fallen into the center of the table, and everyone had felt the impact, and no one felt it like Arya. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She picked up her own glass and took a small, steady sip and smiled at something one of the other women said, and she was so composed and so complete in her composure that Minjae, glancing at her finally, felt the brief, strange impression that nothing had happened. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. What happened in Arya that night was not new. It was the final pressure applied to something that had been fracturing for a long time. The last quiet crack in a wall that had been holding back 3 years of a particular kind of pain. Not the loud theatrical pain of betrayal or violence. The quieter, more corrosive kind. The pain of being beside someone and being invisible to them. The pain of loving a person who treated your love as background noise. She had known, of course. She had always known what the marriage was. She wasn't naive. She'd grown up around men like Minjae, men who moved through the world as though it existed to serve their function. She had entered the arrangement with her eyes open, telling herself that things could change, that proximity could eventually become warmth, that patience was a form of investment. For 2 years she had told herself that, and sitting at that dinner table, listening to her husband answer the simplest question in the English language with a single unambiguous no and then reach for his coffee without a second thought, she finally heard herself clearly. She had not been investing, she had been disappearing. She went home first, telling Minjae she had a headache. He nodded without looking up from a conversation with Ferretti. She took the car back to the penthouse and sat for a long time in the living room in the dark, not crying, not thinking in words exactly, just sitting with the particular heaviness of something finally admitted. By the time Minjae came home at 11:30, she had gone to bed. He moved through the penthouse in his usual late-night silence, and she heard him from behind the closed bedroom door, the refrigerator opening, the brief clink of glass. And she lay still in the dark and felt the distance between them not as emptiness, but as something physical. A weight. An honest thing. She made a decision in those dark hours. Not from rage, not from a desire to wound him, from a simple, exhausted clarity that she had been postponing for too long. She was going to stop. She was going to stop waiting, stop hoping, stop making coffee he never acknowledged, and preparing dinners he consumed without comment, and standing beside him in rooms where he introduced her to people with the same tone he used for his car service. She was going to stop loving him in a marriage where she was the only one doing it. It took her 3 weeks to arrange. She did it quietly, methodically, in the way she did most things. A lawyer she had known from her family's circle, conversations conducted during her lunch hours, paperwork that she reviewed in the back of cars while Min-jae was at meetings she was not invited to. She moved a portion of her personal funds, the money that had always remained in her own name from her own family's accounts, to a separate institution. She found an apartment. She gave notice at 2 committees she'd joined because they intersected with his world, and then she prepared the papers. She didn't tell him it was coming. She had considered it. A conversation, a confrontation, something that might crack open whatever was sealed inside him. But she had replayed too many versions of that conversation in her head, and they all ended the same way. With him looking at her with those dark, impenetrable eyes and saying something clean and terrible that he didn't even understand was clean and terrible. She didn't have the capacity to survive that scene. So she chose the version she could survive. She chose the door. On the last night, a Tuesday in November, just past midnight, she sat at the dining table where she had eaten hundreds of meals across from a man who had never once asked her what she was thinking. She had the papers in front of her, her own pen in her hand. The penthouse was quiet around her, the city glittering and indifferent beyond the glass. She signed where her lawyer had shown her to sign, her handwriting steady, and then she set the pen down and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. She looked around the space, the bookshelves with her books still on them, the kitchen where she had cooked every rosemary lamb he'd ever eaten, the windows that faced east and caught the early morning light she'd watched alone for 3 years. She breathed. Once, slowly. Then she pushed back from the table and picked up the papers and carried them to the study. Min-jae was behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, working through documents with the focused intensity of a man who had never found a problem he couldn't reduce to something manageable. He looked up when she came in. He did that at least. He always looked up when she entered a room. She had once thought that meant something. "It's late," he said. Not unkindly, just a fact. "I know." She crossed to the desk and set the papers down in front of him. He looked at them without reaching for them. Then he looked back at her. "Arya, I'm not asking you to feel anything about this tonight," she said. Her voice came out quieter and steadier than she'd expected. "I just need you to sign. I'm leaving tomorrow morning, and I'd like it to be handled before I go." Something moved in his face, a tightening, a flicker, and she waited for it to become something real, something she could work with, something that proved that 3 years of her life had penetrated even the surface of him. But he looked back down at the papers, his jaw set. And then, with the same decisive efficiency he brought to every document that crossed his desk, he reached for his pen and signed. She had already turned to go when he spoke. "If you leave tonight," he said, "don't expect me to regret it." She stopped. Her back was to him. She stood completely still for 1 breath, 2, 3. Then she walked to the door, pulled it open, and stepped through. Behind her, she heard nothing. No movement, no sound. Not a single thing that suggested the man at the desk had felt the earth shift in any direction. She collected her bag from the foyer. She had already moved the things that mattered most, 3 days ago, quietly, while he was in meetings. What remained was the furniture, the books, the coffee mug she'd used every morning. Things she could replace. Things that did not require her to stay. She took the elevator down alone, stepped out into the garage. The night air coming off the street smelled like rain and exhaust, and the particular coldness of November in New York, and she stood outside for a moment, her bag over her shoulder, her face tilted slightly upward. She wasn't waiting for anything. She had done enough waiting. She got in the car her lawyer had arranged, and she left. Upstairs, in the study of a penthouse that was now entirely his, Kang Min-jae sat behind his desk with the signed divorce papers in front of him and felt, what? He would be unable to answer that question clearly for some time. He told himself in those first minutes that he felt relief. The pragmatic operational relief of a complication resolved. The marriage had served its purpose. 3 years of public stability that had helped him navigate the corporate legitimacy questions his empire increasingly required. It had concluded. That was all. He picked up his pen and returned to the documents he'd been reviewing before she walked in. He worked until 3 in the morning. He did not sleep well, and when he walked into the kitchen just before 6, because he was always awake before sunrise, always, had been, since his early 20s when the habit was survival and had simply never left him, he stopped at the counter and looked at the empty space where the coffee would have been, where it was always, without exception, every single morning for 3 years, been. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to make it himself, pulling open cabinets until he found what he needed, because he didn't know where she kept things in the kitchen he had lived in for 3 years. She had always handled the kitchen, had arranged it the way she preferred, and he had never once opened a cabinet with the intention of actually using it. The coffee he made was bad, too strong, poorly timed. He drank it standing at the window, looking out at the city in the gray early morning, and he felt nothing in the way that a man feels nothing when he is working very hard not to feel something he doesn't yet have a name for. He told himself it would pass, that this was adjustment, transition, that he had navigated harder reconfigurations than the absence of one woman from a penthouse. He was good at telling himself things. In her new apartment across town, a clean, modest space in the West Village, 4 floors up, with a window that faced the street, Aria Whitmore sat on the floor among half-unpacked boxes and drank green tea from a mug that was entirely her own. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Outside, the city was waking up around her, the sounds of it rising and familiar and entirely neutral. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the specific, exhausted, clean sensation of a woman who has finally stopped surviving a thing and started living past it. She didn't know yet what past it looked like. She only knew she had chosen it. Across Manhattan, in a study full of documents and power and silence, the most feared man in New York City sat with a bad cup of coffee and a quiet that was already beginning to feel less like peace and more like something he had not been prepared for. He would not admit that for another 3 months. But the clock had already started. Tick. The first week without her was operationally fine. That was how Min-jae categorized it when Daewon asked, on the 3rd morning, whether there was anything that needed to be adjusted in the household arrangements. Operationally fine. A housekeeper was contracted to come 3 times a week. The kitchen was restocked by a service that delivered pre-selected items based on a standing order. The penthouse continued to function as a residence without requiring Min-jae to think about it. He was good at making things function without thinking about them. The second week was when the silence started having edges. It wasn't the absence of noise. Min-jae had always preferred quiet. It was something more specific and harder to name. The penthouse had always been quiet when he was in it, but it had been quiet in the way that a room is quiet when someone is simply in another part of it. Now it was quiet in the absolute way, the way a space is quiet when there is genuinely no one else inside it. And the 2 kinds of quiet were, he discovered, with the irritation he refused to examine, not the same thing at all. He started working later, staying at the office until 9, 10, sometimes 11 before returning to the penthouse. Daewon noted the change without commenting on it, which was one of the things Min-jae valued about him. On a Wednesday night in the 3rd week, he came home to find that the housekeeper had moved Arya's books. They had been on the shelves in the living room, 2 full shelves of them, organized in a way he'd never paid attention to. And the housekeeper, apparently attempting to create some kind of order, had consolidated them into a single stack on the floor near the door. Ready to be removed, presumably. The gesture was practical. Efficient. Exactly the kind of thing he would have approved if asked. He stood in the living room and looked at the stack for a long moment. Then he picked it up and put the books back on the shelves. Not in the right order. He didn't know the right order. But back. On the shelves. Where they had been. He didn't think about why. He poured a drink, went to his study, and worked until 2 in the morning, and he did not think about the books again. What he thought about instead, in the fragmented, unwilling way that things surface when a man is tired and his defenses are operating below full capacity, was the dinner. The Marchetti dinner. Ferretti's question and his own answer, delivered with the particular clean brutality of a man who had never once considered that truth could also be a weapon you aimed at yourself. He thought about Arya's face in the second after he'd said it. She hadn't flinched. That was the thing that kept surfacing. She hadn't flinched or gone pale or pressed her lips together the way people did when they were working to hold something in. She had simply absorbed it, the way a wall absorbs impact. And something about that absorption, something about the sheer practice quality of it, told him in the way that certain kinds of information arrive not as thought, but as sensation, that it had not been the first time, that she had been absorbing things like that for a long time. He poured another 2 fingers of bourbon and put the thought away. He was good at putting things away. He was less good at keeping them there. The call from his grandmother came on a Friday morning while he was in a board meeting for one of the real estate holding companies. And he let it go to voicemail, and then listened to the voicemail in the elevator on the way back up to his main office. And the voicemail was 40 seconds of his grandmother, a 71-year-old woman who had survived 2 wars, 3 betrayals, and the building of a criminal empire from a single produce warehouse in Incheon, telling him in a voice that carried no particular warmth that she had heard about the divorce from her attorney, that she expected an explanation, and that he should come to the estate that Sunday without fail. He went on Sunday. The Kong estate was 40 minutes outside the city, behind a gate that was never photographed and a tree line that absorbed sound. His grandmother, Park Soon-hee, was waiting for him in the garden room when he arrived. A small, straight-backed woman in a dark dress, with white hair pulled back severely and eyes that had the quality of instruments rather than features. She was drinking tea. She did not offer him any. "Sit," she said. He sat. "How long?" she said. "The papers were filed 3 weeks ago." "I asked how long, not when." He looked at her. "It wasn't working." "It was working perfectly," she said. The flatness in her voice was specific. Not cold exactly, but stripped of every unnecessary thing, the way certain very old, very hard people speak when they've lost patience with imprecision. It was working perfectly for this family, for the Holloway situation, for the limb consolidation, and for the 11 other things I don't have to list for you because you already know them. What you mean is that it was not working for you personally, which is a different sentence. Then that's what I mean. What did you do to her? It wasn't a question. Min-jae's jaw tightened. Nothing. His grandmother set her teacup down with a precision that was itself a form of commentary. Kang Min-jae, I am 71 years old, and I have watched men of your particular construction move through the world my entire life. I know exactly what nothing looks like when a man like you says it. She paused. Arya Whitmore is not a weak woman. She did not walk away from a marriage because of nothing. She made her choice. And you made yours first, repeatedly. She looked at him steadily. I chose her for you because she had the quality that you have never had and have always needed. Patience. Genuine patience, not the strategic kind. And you spent 3 years treating that patience like it was a structural feature of the arrangement rather than a thing a specific human being was choosing to give you every single day. Another pause. That is not nothing. Min-jae said nothing. His hands were still on the table. His breathing was even. He had learned to hold himself very still when he was being taken apart by someone who knew where the seams were. Is it fixable? He said finally. His grandmother looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her eyes. Not sympathy, not exactly, but a kind of precise recognition. I don't know, she said. That depends entirely on what you are willing to do, and more importantly, on what she is willing to accept, which is not the same question it would have been 12 months ago. He drove back to the city in silence and didn't speak to Daiwon for the entire 40-minute drive. He thought about what his grandmother had said, the thing about patience, about Arya choosing it. He had never thought of it as a choice. He had thought of it as a temperament, a characteristic, something she simply was. The same way he thought of her competence in social situations or her ability to manage the domestic architecture of their lives. It was just Arya. It was just how she was. But a choice made daily, repeatedly, over 3 years, in response to a person who was giving her nothing to work with. He sat with that in the car and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling, something that sat low and uncomfortable in his chest and didn't have a clean operational category. He was still sitting with it when Sabrina called. He let it ring twice before answering. I heard about the filing, she said. Her voice was measured, neutral in the specific way that wasn't actually neutral. I wanted to check in. I'm fine. I know you're fine. A pause, light and loaded. I just wanted you to know I'm available. If you need to talk through anything, or anything else. The anything else landed exactly where she'd aimed it. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the city scrolled past in its November gray. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'll be in touch about the Brentwood account this week." A beat. "Of course." Her voice hadn't changed. "Take care of yourself, Minjai." He hung up and looked at his phone for a moment, and then he looked out the window, and the low, uncomfortable thing in his chest shifted slightly, and he turned his face away from it and focused on the road ahead. He did not call Sabrina back that week, or the next. He told himself it was because of the Brentwood complications. He told himself a lot of things that month. Arya, meanwhile, was learning what it felt like to live in a space that was entirely her own. The West Village apartment was small compared to the penthouse. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced the interior courtyard, windows that let in the specific late-afternoon light she had loved and lost in the east-facing penthouse. She bought furniture slowly, deliberately, choosing each piece herself. She cooked things she wanted to eat rather than things someone else preferred. She stayed up too late reading on her couch and nobody commented on it. She also cried, twice. Once in the shower on a Wednesday, briefly and furiously, and once sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a half-drunk glass of wine in front of her, over nothing she could specifically identify. Just a wave of something that arrived without warning and had to be gone through, not around. Both times she let it happen completely, without apology, and both times she came out the other side feeling marginally lighter rather than depleted. She had a therapist she'd been seeing since the 2nd year of the marriage, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Fenn, who had an office in the Flatiron district and who had watched Arya spend 18 months describing her marriage in careful, reasonable language before asking, very gently, whether the reasonableness was Arya's actual experience or Arya's management of her actual experience. That question had arrived like a small detonation. Arya still thought about it. She thought about it now, in the context of the apartment, and the new furniture, and the late nights, and the wine. And she acknowledged to herself, with the particular exhausted honesty of someone who had recently stopped performing composure for an audience of one, that she had spent 3 years managing her experience of a man who had never once managed himself on her behalf. She was angry. She hadn't let herself be angry while she was in it, because anger required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required a witness. And he had never been a witness to anything she felt. But now, in the privacy of her own space, she let the anger exist. She didn't perform it. She didn't direct it. She just let it live in the room alongside her, like a guest who had arrived late but had always been expected. Her phone rang less than it used to. Most of the social architecture of the past 3 years had been his world, his associates, his grandmother's circle, the events that required Arya Kang rather than Arya Whitmore. She didn't miss those rooms. She found, with some surprise, that she didn't miss most of the people in them either. What she missed, and she was honest about this too, was the version of her life she had believed she was building. Not him, specifically. The idea of him. The possibility she had spent 3 years extending credit to. She was done extending credit. She started having lunch with her own friends again. Women she'd known before the marriage, a journalist named Clara, a landscape architect named Mia, who had been mildly crowded out by the density of Minjay's world, and who now reappeared in her life with the easy warmth of people who had never actually left. It was Clara who introduced her to Nathan Cross. It happened at a gallery opening in early December, a low-key evening in a Chelsea space showing the work of a photographer Arya had followed for years. Clara arrived with Nathan, who was a business contact turned friend, and introduced them with the offhand ease of someone who wasn't matchmaking but wouldn't mind if something happened. Nathan was 38, mild-featured, open-faced, with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. He ran a sustainable materials company that had turned unexpectedly profitable over the past 5 years, and now sat at the intersection of real business and genuine environmental principle in a way that wasn't pretentious about either. He asked Arya what drew her to the photographer's work. He listened to her answer. He asked a follow-up question. It was such a small thing, being asked something and listened to, that Arya felt it land with a disproportionate weight, the way small lights are brightest when you've been a long time in the dark. They talked for an hour. He asked for her number. She gave it to him. She didn't tell herself it was anything yet. She was too honest with herself for premature narratives, but she drove home that night with something unfamiliar sitting in her chest, lighter than hope, quieter than excitement, but genuinely warm. She hadn't felt warm in a very long time. She did not know that across the city, In a penthouse study, the man she'd left was sitting with a glass of bourbon and a specific crawling restlessness that had been building since October, and that no amount of work or control or compartmentalization was successfully addressing. Min-jae had begun, in those weeks, to notice things he had not previously registered as noticeable. The coffee mug she'd used, small, white, with a slight chip on the handle from a dropped spoon 2 years ago, was still in the cabinet. He had not thrown it away. He had not entirely understood why until one night he found himself standing at the open cabinet at 6 in the morning, looking at it, and realized he'd been standing there for nearly 2 minutes without moving. He closed the cabinet and made his coffee and went to the window. He thought about the chip in the handle. He knew it was from a dropped spoon because he'd been standing in the kitchen when it happened. On one of the rare mornings, he'd come home early enough to catch her making coffee. She'd been reaching for something in the upper cabinet when a spoon had fallen from the drying rack and knocked the mug off the counter. She'd picked it up quickly, checked it, made a small sound of relief when she saw it had only chipped. He had watched this from across the kitchen and said nothing and left for his office 2 minutes later and had not thought of it once in the 18 months since. He thought about it now. He thought about a lot of small things now with an intensity that was starting to alarm him. Not the large gestures, not the dinners or the events or the composed public performance of their marriage. The small things, the particular way she arranged the books, the fact that she cooked barefoot, the sound of her moving through the penthouse in the late evening, quiet and unhurried, a presence he had taken for background and was now understanding had been, in some way he couldn't yet articulate, the thing that made the penthouse feel like something other than a very expensive place to keep his belongings. He was at a charity gala in the second week of December, an annual event for a children's medical foundation that several of his corporate entities supported publicly. Standing near the bar with a glass he wasn't really drinking from, watching the room with the habitual surveillance he brought to every social space when he saw her. Arya was across the room in a deep green gown that he did not recognize, which meant she'd bought it after the divorce, which meant she was going to events like this without him, which meant he absorbed this information with a slowness that was not typical for him. She was living a life that no longer had him anywhere in its geography. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, head tilted slightly, one hand rising to her collarbone in the way she did when something caught her off guard as funny. Beside her stood a man Min-jae didn't immediately recognize. Mid-30s, open face, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back with the easy familiarity of someone who had been invited to put it there. Min-jae's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He stood very still. The noise of the room continued around him, the particular blurred wash of a large social gathering, music underneath conversation, underneath the soft percussion of crystal and silverware. And inside all of that noise he felt something arrive in his chest with the velocity and precision of something that had been traveling toward him for a long time. He recognized the man eventually. Nathan Cross. He'd been briefed on him peripherally. Sustainable materials, recent profile in a business journal, various philanthropic associations that overlapped with the gala's organizer network. Respectable. Clean. The kind of man whose background required no surveillance because there was nothing in it that wouldn't survive the light. The kind of man, Min-jae thought, with a coldness that was sliding towards something else entirely, who deserved to have his hand on the small of a woman's back. He watched Nathan Cross lean down and say something close to Arya's ear. Watched her laugh again, differently this time, softer, more private. He felt something crack open inside him that he had no operational category for. Something that wasn't anger, wasn't jealousy in any clean sense, wasn't grief. Something more fundamental than any of those. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a height and looking down and understanding for the first time that the ground was much farther away than he had assumed. He put his glass down on the bar behind him, carefully, without sound. Daewon materialized at his shoulder within seconds. The man had an instinct for when Min-jae's stillness changed quality, and said nothing, just positioned himself at the precise distance that said, "I'm here without saying what's wrong." "Find out everything about Nathan Cross," Min-jae said quietly. "Whatever isn't already in the standard file." "By when?" "Tomorrow morning." Daewon moved away. Min-jae stayed at the bar for another 4 minutes, not drinking, watching the room with the controlled attention of a man who had learned early that visible reaction was a form of surrender. Then he located the gala's host, made the necessary circuit of handshakes and brief, functional conversation, and left before 10 o'clock. In the car, he sat in the dark and said nothing for the entire ride home. The file on Nathan Cross arrived at 7 the next morning. Minjay read it at his desk with his bad, self-made coffee and found nothing in it that gave him anything to work with. Cross was exactly what he appeared to be, successful in a legitimate and moderately admirable way. No criminal exposure, no significant debt, no pattern of behavior that suggested instability or harm. 3 serious relationships in the past decade, none of them ending badly enough to be interesting. His most recent ex-girlfriend had apparently remained on good terms with him, which was either a character indicator or a red flag depending on how you read it, and Minjay spent longer than he should have deciding which before he admitted to himself what he was actually doing. He was looking for a reason to intervene. He closed the file and pushed it to the corner of his desk, and picked up his phone and called the first of his morning operational contacts, and he did not look at the file again. But he thought about it. He thought about it through 3 meetings and a conference call and a lunch he barely tasted, and what he kept returning to, circling it the way his tongue finds a broken tooth, was not Nathan Cross at all. It was Arya's laugh. The second one, the softer one, the private one. He had been married to her for 3 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times he had made her laugh like that. Not because she was humorless, she wasn't. She had a dry, quiet wit that surfaced in small moments he had mostly been too distracted to catch, but because he had never created the conditions for it, had never tried. A man she had known for what? Weeks, maybe, had already created those conditions without apparent effort. That thought had a specific, unpleasant taste that Minjay recognized after some resistance as shame. He was not accustomed to shame. He had done things in his life that most people would categorize as shameful, and had moved through them without significant psychological residue, because in his world, the categories were different. Actions were evaluated by their outcomes, their necessity, their strategic logic. Emotion was a variable to be managed, not a verdict to be accepted. But this was different. This wasn't shame about something he'd done in the operational sense. This was shame about who he had been, daily, incrementally, in the privacy of a marriage to a person who had done nothing to deserve it. That was a different kind of thing entirely. He was still sitting with it, 3 days after the gala, when Sabrina arrived at his office without an appointment. His assistant buzzed through with a slight hesitation in her voice that told him the visit was being presented as urgent. He told her to send Sabrina in, and he stood up from behind his desk and moved to the sitting area near the window because he preferred not to have certain conversations from behind furniture. Sabrina came in wearing a dark blazer, carrying a leather portfolio, and looking like a woman who had decided something and was not second-guessing it. She closed the door herself. She sat without being invited to. "I need to talk to you about the Brentwood restructure," she said. "Then talk." She opened the portfolio and laid 3 documents on the coffee table between them. Minjay looked at them. They were transfer authorizations, internal movement of funds between 3 of the holding entities, routed through the Brentwood account in a configuration he recognized as his own operational signature, down to the specific sequencing he used for transactions that needed to move quickly without triggering standard review protocols. He had not authorized these transfers. The silence in the room changed quality. "Where did these come from?" he said. His voice was level. That was a trained response. The more dangerous the information, the quieter he became. "They were filed 11 days ago," Sabrina said, "through the Brentwood Secondary Access Channel, under your authorization codes." "I didn't authorize these." "I know." She met his eyes steadily. "That's why I'm here." He picked up the first document and looked at it with the focused attention of a man who understood finance at the level of instinct. The transfers totaled just under $4 million, moved in 3 tranches across a 6-day window in a pattern designed to stay below the internal thresholds that would automatically flag for his personal review. Whoever had structured this knew the system from the inside, knew it well enough to know exactly where the edges of his blind spots were. "Who has access to my authorization codes?" he said. "Officially, myself, Daiwan, and your primary attorney. Unofficially," Sabrina's jaw shifted slightly. "That's a more complicated answer." "Then give me the complicated answer." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face, but not guilt, but the particular expression of someone who is about to say a thing they've been holding for a while and has finally decided the cost of holding it is higher than the cost of saying it. 6 months before the divorce, she said, Arya came to the Brentwood offices. I assumed you'd sent her for something administrative. It wasn't unusual for her to handle peripheral tasks for you. She spent about 40 minutes with Marcus in systems compliance. A pause. I didn't think about it at the time. Min-jae looked at her. Say it clearly. Marcus handled the secondary access architecture for 3 of the holding accounts, including Brentwood. He left the company 4 months ago. Another pause, shorter. I found out last week that he's currently employed by Whitmore Capital, the Whitmore family's investment firm, Arya's family. Min-jae sat very still. The window behind him threw cold December light across the room, and he was aware of each specific detail of the space around him, the weight of the document in his hand, the particular sound of the building's ventilation, the precise distance between himself and the woman across from him, in the heightened sensory way that his mind operated when it was processing something it needed to process very carefully. You're telling me, he said slowly, that Arya was gathering access intelligence on my financial architecture while we were still married. I'm telling you what I observed and what I've since confirmed. I'm not telling you what it means. Who else knows about this? Just me. And now you. He set the document down on the table. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and he breathed, measured, deliberate, the way he had learned to breathe a long time ago when the alternative was a reaction that couldn't be walked back. He thought about Arya signing the divorce papers, the steadiness of her hands, the composure he had read as dignity and was now rereading through a lens that made the image entirely different. He thought about the 40 minutes in the Brentwood offices, the careful, quiet intelligence of a woman who had spent 3 years learning his habits, his preferences, the music he listened to when he worked. What else had she been learning? The thought arrived with a cold, sickening momentum, and Min-jae stood at the window and let it arrive fully, because he had learned that half-processed information was more dangerous than complete information, however terrible. He turned around. Pull everything from the Brentwood secondary channel for the past 18 months, he said. All access logs, all entry points, every transaction, regardless of size. I want it on my desk by end of day. And the 4 million. Freeze the receiving accounts. Don't move anything yet. He paused. Don't involve external counsel. Not yet. Sabrina nodded. She collected the documents from the table, stood, and moved toward the door with the efficiency of someone who understood that the meeting was over. At the door, she stopped, her hand on the frame, and looked back at him. Min-jae. Her voice had shifted slightly, less boardroom, something more unguarded underneath. I want you to consider the possibility that there's an explanation for this that isn't what it looks like. He looked at her. Is there a reason you believe that? A pause. Because I spent a year watching that woman love you in a way that didn't have a strategic angle, and I know what strategic angles look like. She held his gaze for a moment. So do you. She left. The door closed quietly behind her. Min-jae stood in the center of his office for a long time. The access logs arrived at 4:15, compiled by his internal security team in a format that required 2 hours of close reading to fully parse. He read them alone, at his desk, with the door locked and his phone switched to silent, and what he found was at once more and less than he had feared. The access pattern from the Brentwood secondary channel showed 11 entries over 14 months, the first predating Arya's visit to the offices, which reframed that visit immediately, and the last occurring 3 days before she filed for divorce. The entries were read only. No transactions had been initiated from those access points. Whoever had been using the channel had been observing the architecture, not moving within it, which meant the 4 million in unauthorized transfers had not come from the same source. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and reorganized everything he thought he understood. 2 separate intrusions. One, careful and observational, running for over a year through a channel connected to a person who had subsequently moved to Arya's family firm. One, active and financial, using his own authorization codes, filed 11 days ago, months after Arya had left, when she no longer had any proximity to his operational life. He called Daewon. The secondary Brentwood access, he said when Daewon answered. I want to know who trained Marcus Lim in systems compliance when he first joined the company. A pause while Daewon checked. The primary trainer on record is listed as the former head of financial systems. Another pause. Cross-referenced with the general compliance onboarding from that period. Sabrina Vale's department ran the systems integration. Min-jae closed his eyes, opened them. And the authorization codes for the transfers, he said carefully. Who, in the past 18 months, has had physical or digital proximity to those codes outside of the standard access list? I'd need to run a full audit to be certain. Run it. Min-jae? Daewon's voice was careful in the way it got careful when he was about to say something his employer was not going to want to hear. You should know. Sabrina Vale requested a copy of the internal authorization framework document 8 months ago for the Brentwood restructure proposal. I approved it at the time because the request came through proper channels. The authorization framework, which contained the code architecture, which contained, for anyone who knew how to read it, the signature patterns that Min-jae used for legitimate high-speed transfers. He thought about Sabrina sitting across from him this morning. The documents laid out with quiet precision. The specific framing, I need to talk to you about the Brentwood restructure, that had walked him directly toward one conclusion while she stood at the door of his office and told him to consider the possibility that Arya wasn't what she looked like. He had spent 40 minutes suspecting the wrong person, and she had let him. He stood up from his desk so abruptly the chair rolled back and hit the credenza behind him. He crossed to the window, and the city outside was doing its ordinary December thing. Lights coming on in the early dark, traffic accumulating on the streets below, the vast indifferent machinery of 11 million lives grinding forward. And he pressed one hand flat against the glass and breathed through what he was feeling, because the alternative involved decisions he couldn't unmake. Sabrina Vale had access to his codes. Sabrina Vale had been in his life, at the margins of his life, for the better part of a decade. She had known him before the marriage and during it and after it, and she had known exactly how to position herself at each stage, professionally indispensable, personally available, never overstepping in any way that could be called out directly. He thought about the Marchetti dinner, her idea, ostensibly to facilitate the Ferretti negotiation, her presence, effortless and reclaiming, her question, "Are you finally in love with your wife?" delivered to Ferretti's side of the table in a tone that had seemed like lightness and now felt like something else, something calculated. Because if Min-jae answered no, which she knew he would, because she knew him with the specific intimate knowledge of someone who had studied him for years, then Arya heard it in the worst possible context, in public, from her husband's mouth, without softening, without privacy, without any of the ambient signals that might have allowed her to absorb it differently. And 3 weeks later, the divorce papers appeared on his desk. He stood at the window for a long time. Outside, the first thin snow of December was beginning to fall, barely visible against the dark sky, catching the light of the city before it dissolved. He thought about a woman in an emerald gown, laughing across a gala room, with a warmth in her face that he had never managed to put there. He thought about 3 years of coffee made and mornings alone, and a woman absorbing his indifference with a steadiness he had mistaken for temperament and was now understanding was an act of sustained, exhausting love. He thought about 7 words he had said at a doorway and the particular quality of the silence that followed them. And then he thought about Sabrina Vale, who had known all of those things and had spent the morning sitting across from him and pointing his anger in the wrong direction with the careful, patient precision of someone who had been planning the angle for a very long time. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from day 1. Audit preliminary results. You need to see this now. He was already moving toward the door when his phone rang. Not Daewon, a different number. One he recognized as belonging to his grandmother's estate. He answered it. It was not his grandmother. It was her personal secretary, a woman who had worked for the family for 20 years and whose voice he had never heard anything other than composed, and whose voice now carried something he had never heard before. Mr. Kang. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual professional coating. Your grandmother collapsed 40 minutes ago. She's been taken to Lenox Hill. They're saying it was her heart. He was in the elevator before she finished the sentence. The drive to Lenox Hill took 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the dashboard with the focused, slightly dissociated attention of a man whose mind is running 2 processes simultaneously. One managing logistics, one doing something that didn't have a clean name. Daewon drove. Min-jae sat in the back and did not speak. and did not look at his phone and did not think about the audit or Sabrina or the $4 million or any of the machinery of his empire that was currently running without his attention. He thought about his grandmother's hands, the specific way she held a teacup, the 40-year-old habit of setting it down with that precise, commentary-laden click. He thought about the last thing she'd said to him. I don't know. That depends entirely on what you are willing to do. The hospital waiting area outside the cardiac unit was beige and fluorescent and smelled like recycled air and industrial cleaning products, and Min Jae stood in it for 3 hours while people in scrubs moved past him with the purposeful efficiency of a world that did not pause for the fears of powerful men. He did not sit. He stood near the window at the end of the corridor with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, and he waited. The cardiologist was a small, direct woman named Dr. Osei, who looked at him with the particular calibrated frankness of someone who delivered difficult information regularly and had learned that softening it didn't actually help. She's stable, she said. The event was significant, a substantial blockage in the left anterior descending artery. We've intervened and she's resting. But I want to be honest with you about what this means going forward. Tell me, she's 71, and this is not her first cardiac episode, though it's the most serious. The next 6 weeks are critical. Activity needs to be severely restricted. Stress, she paused, choosing her words with precision, is not an abstract concern. It's a direct physiological variable for her now. She needs quiet, stability, and she needs people around her who can provide that, not people who generate more variables. Min Jae nodded once. Can I see her? Briefly. She's asked for you. His grandmother looked smaller in the hospital bed. That was the first thing he registered, and it landed somewhere under his ribs with a physical weight, because Park Soon-hee was a woman who had never looked small in any context in his memory. She was connected to monitors that charted the function of her heart in green lines across a screen, and her white hair was loose around her shoulders rather than pulled back. And her eyes, when they found him across the room, were still precisely themselves. Sharp, measuring, missing nothing. But there was a tiredness behind them that he had not seen before. He sat in the chair beside her bed. He didn't speak immediately. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You look terrible." "You're in a hospital bed." "I'm aware of where I am." A pause, shorter than her pauses usually were. She was conserving something. "What happened today, before they called you?" He told her. Briefly, with precision. The unauthorized transfers, the access logs, the authorization codes, Sabrina's morning visit, and the angle of it. His grandmother listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on his face, her breathing slow and deliberate in the way of someone who was managing their own body with conscious effort. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long?" she said finally. "I don't know yet. The audit will tell me more." "Not the money?" Her voice was quiet, but the precision in it hadn't dimmed. "How long have you known what kind of person Sabrina Vale is?" Min Jae looked at his hands. "I knew what she was. I thought I had it contained. You thought you could manage it because you managed everything." Another measured breath. "You put a woman who wanted your life next to the woman who simply wanted you, and you didn't see the problem." He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer worth giving. "The Whitmore girl," his grandmother said. "Her name is Aria." Something shifted in his grandmother's expression. Very slight, very brief. "Go find her," she said. "Not for any of the other reasons. Not for the family or the exposure or what Sabrina may or may not have done. Find her because you should have found her a long time ago, and you are running out of time to do things you should have done a long time ago." She paused. "I am evidence of that fact." He stayed another 20 minutes. He didn't say much. She didn't either. But when he stood to leave, she reached out and put her hand briefly over his, and that gesture, from a woman who expressed affection the way other people expressed legal arguments, rarely and with complete precision, settled something in him that he didn't have words for. He walked out of the cardiac unit and into the corridor and pulled out his phone and called Daewon. "Find Sabrina," he said. "Tell her I need to meet. Tonight. My office. And if she asks what it's about, tell her the Brentwood audit. She'll come." She came at 9:15. Min Jae's office at night had a different quality than during business hours. The building quieter around it, the city visible in full dark beyond the windows, the overhead lighting replaced by the lower, more concentrated illumination of the desk lamp and the floor lamp near the sitting area. He was standing when Sabrina arrived, which he had chosen deliberately because standing meant the room's geography was his. She came in looking composed. Dark coat, not yet removed, her portfolio under her arm. She read the room in the first 2 seconds. His position, the absence of anything on the coffee table that suggested a working meeting, the particular quality of the silence, and her expression adjusted by a fraction that most people wouldn't catch. Min-jae caught it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She placed the portfolio on her knee and folded her hands over it and waited. He didn't sit. He stayed standing near the window and he looked at her with the specific, focused attention he usually reserved for men who were about to tell him a lie, and he let the silence run long enough to be uncomfortable before he spoke. "Tell me about Marcus Lim," he said. A beat. Short, well-controlled. "I told you this morning. He handled systems compliance for the Brentwood accounts before he left." "Tell me what you didn't tell me this morning." Her jaw shifted. The portfolio on her knee didn't move. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Yes, you are." He crossed his arms. "The authorization framework document. You requested it 8 months ago. The complete document, including the transaction signature architecture. For the restructure proposal, you know that. And the transfer sequencing I use for high-velocity internal movements. Is that in the section you needed for the restructure proposal?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. In 3 seconds, Min-jae watched Sabrina Vale make a calculation. He could see it happening, could see the processing behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of what he knew and what he could prove, and what the optimal response was given those variables. He had watched people make that calculation many times. He was usually on the other side of it. "You're accusing me of something," she said. Her voice was steady, not defensive. That was the tell. A person who was actually surprised came out defensive. A person who had been waiting for this came out steady. "I'm asking you a question. Then I'll answer it." She looked at him directly. "I requested that document for legitimate professional reasons. If someone used information from it to structure unauthorized transfers, that's a serious problem and you should absolutely pursue it. But the implication that Sabrina." His voice cut across hers, not loud, not angry, but with a finality that stopped her completely. "I've known you for 10 years. I know how you argue when you're right, and I know how you argue when you're managing. You're managing right now." Her chin lifted slightly. Something beneath the composure was shifting, not breaking, she was too controlled for that, but moving. "What do you want me to say?" she said quietly. "I want you to tell me what the last 18 months actually were. All of it." Another silence. This one different in texture, not calculating, something more exposed. "I want you to think carefully," he said, "about the Marchetti dinner, about Ferretti's question and the specific moment you chose to make it happen." Her eyes stayed on his face. "I didn't make anything happen. Ferretti was drunk and asked a thoughtless, you seated him there. You managed the table arrangement through the restaurant coordinator. I checked this afternoon. You put Ferretti where he'd have the most social latitude and the most wine, and you let the dinner run until exactly the right looseness, and then the question happened." He watched her. "And you knew exactly what I would answer, and you knew exactly what that answer would do." Sabrina was quiet for a long moment. The portfolio on her knee was very still. "You were never going to love her," she said finally. Her voice had changed, stripped of the professional layer, something rawer underneath. "You were going to keep her in that penthouse like a well-maintained fixture until it became inconvenient, and then you were going to end it on your terms on your timeline, and she was going to be collateral damage the same way everything around you ends up collateral damage." A pause, controlled but with something hot underneath it now. "I accelerated a timeline, that's all. You accelerated it for her benefit. I accelerated it before you did something worse." Her voice was rising slightly, the first time he'd ever heard it rise. "Because I know what you do to people who stay too close to you, Min-jae. I lived that. And she didn't deserve it." He looked at her for a long moment. The anger that had been building in him for the past 12 hours was still there, but it had clarified into something colder and more precise. "And the $4 million, he said, was that also for her benefit?" The shift in her was immediate and complete. What? The unauthorized transfers filed 11 days ago, using my authorization codes through the Brentwood secondary channel. He watched her face, structured the same way Marcus Lim's access pattern suggested someone had been studying. I didn't. She stopped. Something crossed her face that he hadn't seen before, something that looked almost like genuine shock. Min-jae, I didn't take $4 million. You had the codes. I had the framework document. I never... She stood up abruptly, the portfolio sliding from her knee to the floor. Someone else used it. Someone who had access to my access. She was speaking faster now, the composure cracking in a way that didn't look performed. Marcus left 4 months ago. When he left, I did a standard credential revocation, but if someone had already copied the architecture... Who? Min-jae said. Who in your world had proximity to that document? She looked at him, and for the first time in 10 years, he watched Sabrina Vale look genuinely afraid. My assistant, she said slowly. He's been with me for 14 months. He handles document management for the restructure files. A pause. He came with a referral from the Castellano Network. The Castellano Network. One of the 3 families that had been quietly pressuring Min-jae's operation for the past 2 years, probing for weakness, waiting for an opening. An opening that a destabilized Kang Min-jae, distracted by a divorce, emotionally compromised, his internal operations disrupted, would represent. The room went very still. Where is he now? Min-jae said. His voice was back to the quiet that meant something specific. He should be at the office. He was working late on the... She stopped, pulled out her phone. Her face changed as she looked at the screen. He's not responding. Min-jae was already calling Daiwan. The Castellano Network. I need location data on everyone in the secondary contact tier right now. And I need eyes on Sabrina's assistant. His name is... Park Jin-ho, Sabrina said. Park Jin-ho. Find him. Don't approach until I say. He hung up and looked at Sabrina, and the situation reorganized itself in his mind, with the rapid, cold clarity that extreme pressure sometimes produced. Not calm, nothing like calm, but a focused operational certainty that cut through everything that wasn't immediately essential. The 4 million wasn't theft. It was a signal. A demonstration of access, of penetration, of how deeply someone had gotten inside his architecture while he was looking in the wrong direction. The Castellano family didn't need $4 million. They needed him to know they could take it. They needed him unstable and reactive, and reaching for the wrong answers. He had spent the past 12 hours reaching for the wrong answers. Get out of the building, he told Sabrina. Go somewhere they don't know. Not your apartment, not the office. Call me when you're secure. Min-jae, now. Not loud, just final. She left. He spent the next 40 minutes on the phone, moving pieces. Freezing accounts, rerouting exposure, activating the contacts in the city's law enforcement infrastructure that he maintained specifically for moments when the underworld and the legal world needed to be managed simultaneously. Daewon called back at 10:50 with a location on Park Jin-ho, a parking structure in Midtown, which meant a meeting, which meant he wasn't alone. How many? Min-jae said. 3 others, one of them is flagged in our Castellano file. Mid-tier, logistics. Don't move yet, keep them visual. He paused. And Daewon, Aria Whitmore, I need to know she's secure. A pause on the line. You think she's exposed? I think someone has been inside my life for 14 months, and I don't know all the edges of what they touched. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. Find her location, discreetly. Don't approach, don't alarm her. I just need to know she's safe. He was moving through the office toward the elevator when his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. A burner, untraceable. And the message was 4 words and an image. The 4 words were, "We have your grandmother." The image was a photograph of the corridor outside the cardiac unit at Lenox Hill Hospital, taken within the last hour, with a timestamp in the corner and a small red circle drawn around the door to room 412, his grandmother's room. Min-jae read the message twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting for it with his hands completely still at his sides. And the stillness was not calm. It was the stillness of a man compressing something enormous into a very small space and holding it there through will alone. The elevator opened. He stepped in. He called Day One before the doors closed. "Lenox Hill, room 412. Get there before me and get eyes on every access point. Nobody moves, nobody engages, nobody does anything until I'm in the building. You understand me?" "Understood." "Min-jae, how many are we dealing with?" "I don't know yet. Assume enough." He paused. "And Daiwan. She's 71 and she just had a cardiac event. Whatever happens in that building, she does not get frightened. That is the first condition. Everything else is secondary." He hung up. The lobby doors opened and the December air hit him, cold, sharp, carrying the smell of snow and exhaust. And he walked to the car and got in and said nothing to the driver and watched the city move past the windows and breathed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man preparing himself for something he could not afford to get wrong. He thought about the Castellano family. Third-generation organized crime, Sicilian roots, currently operating through a network of construction and import businesses that gave them legitimate cover and illegitimate reach. He had been aware of their interest in his operation for 2 years and had managed the boundary with the particular combination of financial pressure and implicit threat that kept most conflicts in his world from becoming kinetic. He had believed the pressure was holding. He had been wrong because he had been distracted, not by Sabrina, not by the divorce, not by any of the operational complications, by the specific corrosive distraction of a man who had lost something and hadn't understood it was lost until he saw it living freely without him. He had taken his eyes off the perimeter for 4 months, and the Castellano network had walked through it. That was on him. He held that fact cleanly, without deflection, because deflection was a luxury, and he wasn't in a position to afford luxuries tonight. The car pulled up to Lenox Hill at 11:40. Daewon was already there. Min-jae saw him in the shadows near the side entrance, a stillness among the ambient movement of hospital staff and late-arriving visitors. They made eye contact. Daewon held up 3 fingers, pointed toward the east stairwell, then held up 1 finger and pointed toward the corridor leading to the cardiac unit. 4 men, 1 near his grandmother. Min-jae went in through the main entrance, walking with the unhurried authority of a man who belonged everywhere he went. And he took the elevator to the 4th floor and stepped into the cardiac corridor and immediately understood the geometry of what he was walking into. The corridor was quiet in the specific way of a hospital at midnight. A nurse's station at the far end, 2 staff members visible, the ambient mechanical sounds of monitoring equipment filtering through closed doors. Outside room 412, positioned with the practiced casualness of someone pretending to read a phone, stood a man in dark clothes who was 30 pounds too solid for a regular hospital visitor, and whose eyes moved to Min-jae with the immediate professional assessment of a man who had been told to watch for him. Min-jae walked directly toward him. The man straightened slightly. His hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," Min-jae said quietly. Not stopping, just saying it, the word landing flat and certain in the corridor air. "There are 3 of your people in the east stairwell, and they are currently having a very uncomfortable conversation with my security. You're going to step away from that door, or the conversation is going to get more uncomfortable." The man looked at him. He was maybe 28, dark-eyed, with the tightly controlled expression of someone who had received instructions and was calculating whether those instructions still applied given current variables. His phone buzzed in his hand. He looked at it. Something in his face shifted. He stepped away from the door. Min-jae entered room 412. His grandmother was awake. She was sitting up slightly against the pillows, her monitors recording their steady lines, and she looked at him when he came through the door with eyes that were tired and sharp in equal measure. She was alone in the room. Whatever the Castellano men had planned, a presence, a pressure, a demonstration that they could reach her, they hadn't touched her. The photograph had been the message. Her safety was the leverage. He stood at the foot of her bed for a moment and took 1 full breath. "You're all right," he said. "I'm irritated," she said. "A man stood outside my door for 40 minutes, and when the nurse asked him to move, he showed her something in his wallet, and she went very quiet. I don't like being used as a communication device." "I know." "Is it handled?" "It's being handled." She looked at him steadily. "The Castellano family?" "Yes." "This is because you were distracted." He didn't answer. She read the silence the way she always read it, which was to say completely. "Sit down," she said more quietly than before. He sat. She looked at him for a long moment. This woman who had built a dynasty from a produce warehouse, who had buried a husband and two brothers, and had never once allowed grief to become an operational liability, who had looked at her grandson for 34 years with the precise, unsentimental devotion of someone who loved fiercely by holding people to their highest possible version. "The Castellano situation will resolve," she said. "You will handle it the way you handle things, and there will be a cost, and you will pay it, and it will be over. That is not what I want to talk about." "Grandmother, I am talking." She paused, one breath measured. "I want to talk about the fact that you have been distracted because you finally understand what you lost, and you are running around in the dark bumping into walls instead of simply going to her and telling her the truth." Min-jae looked at his hands. "She's moved on. She's been gone 4 months. She hasn't moved on. She's healing." His grandmother's voice was precise. "Those are not the same thing. Moving on means she has found something that replaced you. Healing means she is rebuilding herself after you failed to be worth her time. One of those is a closed door. The other is still—" She paused, and for a moment something crossed her face that was almost its own kind of wound. "It is still a door." He sat with that. "Go," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight you have work to do. But tomorrow. Go find her and stop managing it like a problem and start surviving it like a human being." She looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for the moments when she was saying something once and only once. "You have your father's capacity for isolation, Min-jae. It kept him safe, and it kept him alone, and he died with no one in the room. I have watched you build the same walls since you were 19 years old. I'm telling you, from a hospital bed with wires attached to my chest, that the walls don't hold. They just mean you fall further when they go." He stayed with her until she slept, which was another hour. He sat in the chair beside her bed in the quiet of the cardiac unit and listened to her breathe and to the soft mechanical confirmation of her heartbeat on the monitor. And something in him, something that had been very tightly held for a very long time, loosened by one increment. He left the hospital at 1 in the morning and spent the next 4 hours with Daiwan and 2 of his most senior legal contacts, dismantling the Castellano network's access to his operation with the cold, systematic efficiency of a man who had nothing left to protect himself from, because the worst of his losses had already happened and turned out to be survivable. The 3 men from the stairwell were released, held briefly, documented thoroughly, returned to their employers with a message that was delivered not in words, but in the comprehensive demonstration that Min-jae's operation had seen everything, documented everything, and was prepared to make that documentation available to several interested federal parties unless the Castellano network's interest in his business ceased immediately and completely. It was the kind of message that worked because both sides understood the language. Park Jin-ho was found at a hotel in Midtown at 3 in the morning and brought in for a conversation that lasted 2 hours and produced a full accounting of 14 months of intelligence gathering, including the identity of 3 other embedded contacts Min-jae had not known about, and the specific operational chain that led back to the Castellano family's current leadership. Min-jae forwarded the accounting to his federal contact at 4:15, along with the transaction records from the Brentwood secondary channel. And by 6 in the morning, the problem had been handed off to people whose job it was to finish it through channels that wouldn't require Min-jae to be visible. He drove home in the early gray of a December morning and went upstairs to the penthouse and stood in the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee that was, as always, too strong and poorly timed. And he stood at the window and watched the city come back to light and felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has been through something real. He stood there for a long time. Then he went and took a shower and put on clean clothes and sat at his desk and wrote something on a piece of paper, not typed, handwritten, because some things required the friction of actual contact with the page. And then he sat looking at what he'd written for several minutes before he folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He found her address through a contact and felt no ambiguity about using that contact for this specific purpose, because there were things he had used his power for that he would always be able to defend, and there were things he couldn't, and knowing where the woman he should have loved better was living fell firmly into the category of defensible. He drove himself. No security, no convoy, no armor, just him and the car and the West Village streets in the mid-morning December quiet, the sky low and white with the pending weight of snow. He found her building. He parked. He sat in the car for a long moment. Then he got out. He pressed her buzzer at 10:43 in the morning and stood on the front step of her building with his hands in his coat pockets and his face tilted slightly downward against the cold, and he waited. He heard the intercom crackle. Yes, her voice. After 4 months of absence, it arrived in his chest like something physical. It's Min Jae, he said. A long silence. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Long enough that he started composing what he would do next, what other approach was available, whether there was a version of this that didn't require her to open the door. Then the intercom clicked off and he heard the door's electronic lock disengage. He went up 4 flights without using the elevator because he needed the 4 flights. He needed the time in the stairwell, the sound of his own footsteps, the physical reality of climbing towards something rather than simply arriving at it. By the time he reached the 4th floor, his breathing was slightly elevated and his hands were cold, and his heart was moving at a pace that had nothing to do with the stairs. Her door was at the end of the corridor. It was open, just slightly. Not invitation exactly, but not refusal. He walked to it and knocked on the frame and pushed it gently and stepped through. The apartment was small and clean and entirely her. Books on shelves arranged in a way he didn't recognize because it was her own system, chosen freely. A kitchen with herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill, a couch with a blanket folded over one arm. Morning light coming through a window that faced the street and fell across the floorboards in a long, pale rectangle. Arya was standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed over her chest, watching him come in. She was wearing dark jeans and a gray sweater and her hair was down, and she looked like herself. Not the gala version, not the penthouse version, not any of the composed and polished iterations he had taken for granted. She looked like the version of herself she was when no one required anything of her. She looked like someone who had been healing. He stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at her. He felt the full weight of everything he wanted to say arriving all at once and understood, in that moment, that he was not going to manage this the way he managed everything. He was going to feel it and say it and let it be as uncontrolled and insufficient as it was, because she deserved at least that much honesty. "I know I don't have the right to be here," he said. She said nothing. Her arms stayed crossed. "I know that what I'm about to say is too late. I know you know that better than I do." He paused. "I'm going to say it anyway because I've spent my whole life not saying things, and it hasn't produced anything worth keeping." She looked at him steadily. Her chin was up slightly, the composure intact, but underneath it he could see something, a tension, a careful bracing, the posture of someone standing in the wind and not wanting to be seen, holding themselves against it. "I was not a husband to you," he said. "I was a presence in your house. I ate the food you made, and I attended the events you managed, and I let you love me for 3 years while I gave you the absolute minimum that the word marriage technically required. And I told myself it was because I didn't feel anything, but the truth." He stopped because the next part required something he had spent his entire adult life building walls against, and the walls were still there. And he was going to have to say it anyway. "The truth is that I felt things. I just didn't think you were someone I had to protect those feelings from. I didn't think losing you was a real category of event." Arya's jaw tightened. Something moved in her eyes. She didn't speak. "I understand why you left," he said. "I understand it completely, and I'm not here to argue against it. What you chose was right. What I said at the door was—" He stopped again. "That was the worst thing I have ever done. And I have done things that most people would find worse, but they were not worse because you were standing there and I had the chance to be something different. And I chose to be what I'd always been instead, which was unreachable. And I said it like it was strength, and it was the opposite." The room was quiet around them. Outside, the first snow of the day was beginning. He could see it through her window, soft and without drama, settling on the street below. "Min Jae," her voice was careful, low. "Why are you here?" "Because I love you," he said. "Not because I figured it out at the gala watching you with someone else. Not because the penthouse got quiet and I noticed, though both of those things are true. Because it was always true, and I never let myself know it until I didn't have it to be afraid of anymore." He looked at her directly. "I love you. I think I loved you somewhere in the first year, and I walled it off because I didn't have the architecture for it. Because everyone in my life had always wanted something from me, and you just wanted me to be there. And I didn't know what to do with that. so I treated it like it wasn't real. Arya uncrossed her arms. She lowered them to her sides. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the full complexity of what was moving through her. Not just emotion, but history. 3 years of specific accumulated hurt. The particular exhausted wisdom of a woman who had already done the work of extracting herself from something that had diminished her and was not naturally inclined to walk back toward it. "You hurt me in ways you didn't even notice," she said finally. "That's the part you need to understand. Not the big things, the everyday things. The 1,000 small moments where I was right there and you looked through me. That kind of hurt doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from indifference, and indifference is harder to forgive because it means you simply didn't see me as worth the effort." "I know." "Do you?" Not challenging, genuinely asking. "I know because I've spent 4 months seeing every single one of those moments with complete clarity," he said. "I know because your coffee mug has a chip in the handle from a dropped spoon, and I watched it happen and said nothing and left. And I remember it now with the specific detail of something that should have been a moment between two people and wasn't, because I didn't make it one." He paused. "I see it all. I see it the way you can only see something when it's gone." Arya looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking down at the snowing street. And she was quiet for long enough that he simply stood and waited and let her have the silence without trying to fill it. "Nathan is a good man," she said. "I know. He's kind to me. He asks me questions and listens to the answers." She paused. "He's not you, and I don't—" Another pause, shorter. "I don't know what that means yet. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not trying to survive a marriage." "I'm not asking you to come back," Minjae said. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I just needed you to know what was true. You spent 3 years not knowing what was true inside me, and you deserve to know. That's why I'm here." She turned from the window. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she used to look at him in the early months when she had still believed that attention could eventually reach something, but differently now. Without the hope that had once been in it, and without the absence of hope either. With something clearer and more grounded than either. The look of a woman who had learned to see people accurately rather than hopefully, and was applying that accuracy now. "You look tired," she said. "My grandmother had a cardiac event last night." Something shifted immediately in her face. "Is she—" "She's stable. She's going to be all right." He paused. "She told me to come find you." A small, involuntary expression crossed Arya's face. Not quite a smile, but something in that vicinity. "Of course she did." "She said—" He stopped. "She said you weren't someone who had moved on. She said there was a difference." Arya looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen and picked up the kettle and filled it at the sink, and he stood in the middle of the room and watched her do this simple, ordinary thing, and the watching of it had a weight he hadn't been prepared for. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea." He sat at her kitchen table. It was smaller than the dining table in the penthouse. Simple wood, with a small mark near one edge that looked like a heat ring from a mug. He looked at that mark while she moved around the kitchen. He listened to the sound of her. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him. Not the length of a penthouse dining table between them. 3 feet of ordinary kitchen table. She wrapped her hands around her cup. She looked at him. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I'm not the same person I was when I left. I spent 3 years making myself smaller so the marriage could keep working, and it took me until I was gone to understand how much smaller I had gotten. I'm not doing that again. Not for anyone." "I don't want you smaller," he said. "I never wanted that. I just didn't know how to—" He stopped and said it plainly. "I didn't know how to be with someone without keeping them at a distance. I didn't trust that someone could be close to me without wanting something damaging from that closeness." "Because everyone always did." "Yes." She looked at her cup. "I know that. I knew that about you when I married you. I thought—" She paused. "I thought patience would eventually get through it. I was wrong about the method, not about what was underneath." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I always believed there was something in you that was worth reaching," she said quietly. "I still believe that. That's the part that makes this complicated." She looked up at him directly. "I'm not saying yes to anything, Minjae. I'm not saying I'll come back. I'm not saying I'll give you another chance because I don't know yet, and I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear just because you drove here in the snow. I'm not asking for yes, he said. I'm asking for the possibility of being seen while I'm doing the work of becoming someone worth saying yes to. The room was very quiet. The snow outside the window was heavier now, covering the street below in a clean, unhurried white. Arya looked at him for a long time. He sat across from her with no defenses up and no strategy running and no version of himself that was useful in the way he'd spent his whole life being useful. Just a man at a small kitchen table, holding a cup of tea he'd barely touched, looking at the only person who had ever simply wanted him to be present. "Okay," she said finally. Quiet. Not a yes, not the opening of a door thrown wide. Just a word, single and careful and honest, that meant, I am still here, and I am still paying attention, and I have not closed this all the way. He nodded once. He wrapped his hands around his cup and looked out her window at the falling snow, and something in his chest that had been compressed for longer than 4 months, longer than the marriage, longer than his grandmother's hospital room, longer than any specific event he could point to, released by one more increment, not healed, not resolved, not the end of a difficult thing, the beginning of a different one. He stayed for an hour. They talked, not about the marriage, not about Sabrina or the Castellano situation, or any of the machinery of the life he'd built, about small things, about her apartment and the herbs she was growing in the kitchen window and the photographer's work she'd seen at the gallery, about his grandmother, who she had always liked, and who had always, he admitted, liked her considerably more than she'd ever explicitly said, about the particular quality of the morning snow, which was already softening the edges of the street below into something gentler than the city usually allowed itself to be. She did not touch him. He did not reach for her. They sat at the small table and drank tea and talked in the way that two people talk when they are being very careful and very honest simultaneously, and it was not comfortable in the easy sense, but it was real in a way that almost nothing in his life had been for a very long time. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. He stopped on the threshold and looked back at her. "Thank you for opening the door," he said. She leaned against the door frame with her arms loosely crossed. "Don't make me regret it," she said. Not hard, almost quiet enough to be tender. He walked down the 4 flights. He stepped out into the snow. He stood on the sidewalk outside her building for a moment with his face turned up slightly toward the white sky, and the snow fell on him and he let it, and he felt the cold of it and the silence of it, and the specific unfamiliar sensation of a man who has stopped running from something and turned around to face it. He had things to fix. The operation, the Castellano exposure, the vulnerabilities that 14 months of distraction had opened in his architecture, his grandmother's health, the slow, uncertain work of becoming a person who could be trusted with someone's love rather than simply near it. None of it was going to be easy. None of it was going to be fast. He walked to his car. He got in. He sat for a moment and looked at the building. 4 floors. A window on the street side where he could see the faint indoor light. And then he started the engine and pulled away from the curb and drove out into the snowed-over streets of the city, which were quieter than usual, and somehow, this morning, more bearable for it. 6 months later, the herbs in Arya's kitchen window had been joined by a second row. The apartment was the same small table, same books on the shelves in her own order, same morning light across the floorboards. But there was on the kitchen counter a second coffee cup. Not the chipped one from the penthouse, a new one, chosen deliberately, as everything in this space was. Minjai had learned over those 6 months the particular discipline of a man rebuilding from the inside out. He had closed the Castellano situation, at cost, as his grandmother had predicted, with the specific expenditure of assets and exposure and pride that such resolutions required. He had restructured the Brentwood operation. He had ended his professional relationship with Sabrina Vale with the kind of clean, documented severance that left no ambiguity and no room for revision, and he had done it without cruelty, which he considered a modest form of growth. He had also started showing up, not in the large declarative way of a man trying to perform transformation, in the small, consistent way of a man doing the actual work. He called when he said he would call. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He learned the order of her bookshelves. He cooked, badly at first and then less badly, in a kitchen that was hers, on her terms, at her pace. He visited his grandmother twice a week through her recovery. They played chess, which she won, and drank tea, and she told him things about his father that she had never told him before, not as explanation or excuse, but as context, as the honest passing on of family history that she had been too protective to offer when he was younger, and now understood she no longer had the luxury of withholding. He held those things carefully. He let them change the shape of some things he'd believed for a long time. One evening in late spring, the windows open for the first time since autumn, the sounds of the street coming through clean and unhurried, Min-jae was washing dishes in Arya's kitchen while she sat at the table finishing something she'd been reading, and the specific ordinary quality of the moment arrived in him with a fullness he hadn't been prepared for. He stood at the sink with his hands in the water and looked out the kitchen window at the evening sky, which was doing something spectacular with the light it had left, going gold and then amber, and then the particular deep blue that comes just before dark. "Arya," he said. "Hmm? I'm not going anywhere." A pause. He heard the soft sound of her setting her book down. "I know," she said. "Quiet." "Sure." He finished the dishes. The sky outside went from blue to dark. The city came on around them, all its million-lit windows, all its indifferent and beautiful machinery, and inside a small apartment on the fourth floor of a West Village building, two people sat in the ordinary, hard-won warmth of something that had almost not happened and let the evening come. It was not a perfect thing. It would never be a perfect thing. There were still moments when Min-jae went quiet in the specific old way, and Arya felt the familiar chill of it before he pulled himself back. There were still mornings when she woke early and lay in the dark and took her own inventory, asking herself honestly whether she was present, whether she was choosing this, whether the choosing was coming from strength rather than the old exhausted habit of endurance. Always, when she took that inventory, the answer was yes. She was choosing it. From strength, from clarity, from the honest knowledge of who she was now compared to who she had been, and the further honest knowledge that the man beside her was not the same man she had left, and that the difference was real, and that real things were worth the choosing. Outside, New York moved through its seasons without asking anyone's permission. Inside, in the particular private geography of two people learning each other honestly for the first time, something was being built. Not quickly, not without cost, not with any guarantee except the daily renewable choice to keep building. That was enough. That had always been enough. It had just taken him too long to know it, and her too much pain to wait for him to learn it, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and they lived with both of them, and on the best mornings, which came more often now than either of them had quite expected, the living with them felt less like a wound and more like evidence. Evidence that something broken can, with sufficient honesty and sufficient time, become something that holds.